Are you learning Spanish and having issues remembering when to use ser or estar? This is something that's very common, and I find a lot of people struggle with this, but the reason people struggle is because the way you're learning it is completely wrong. If you go to a school, you probably see something like this, or maybe something like this. This is not a great way to learn how to use ser and estar because this sets you up for thinking in English before you produce something in Spanish. And we all know the best way to speak a language fluently is to not think about it before you do it. So in this video, I'm going to go over the correct way to use ser and estar, the easiest rule to remember so that you can use these correctly, and how you can overcome translating everything in your brain before you say it in Spanish. Trust me, I know it's a little bit difficult, but I've been through the process, and if you listen to what I'm saying, you will be able to speak and think in Spanish just like a native speaker. So let's go ahead and jump in. Why does this method not work? Well, if we look at this method, most teachers are going to say, especially native Spanish teachers, they're going to say ser is for something permanent and estar is for something not permanent. If you've been learning Spanish, you probably know this doesn't work whenever you start to speak. People will say, hey, that's not how we say this. And then they'll go through and correct you and say, no, you have to say ser here, or you have to say estar here. So rather than thinking of it as something temporary and something permanent, I like to take a very simple approach to this. First of all, instead of a list of rules like these, I'm going to give you two simple rules. You only have to remember two rules and you'll be able to use this correctly 98% of the time. And we're going to check and see what you can do for the other 2% of the time. So the first thing to know is that ser is definitely for something that doesn't change. We have to use ser for something that is permanent, and that rule you can actually follow very simply. But here's the problem with using that rule. Whenever you start to think about something that's permanent, your brain starts thinking before you even produce something in Spanish, is this going to be right? Is this going to be wrong? And if you're like me, that's going to cause you a little bit of anxiety. You don't want to be doing this every time you're speaking in Spanish. Instead, you want to overcome that fear, that anxiety. So how do we do it? This is the golden key. You have to listen to people speak in Spanish, and you have to practice using it. But whenever you're listening to somebody speak in Spanish, you can listen, are they using ser or estar? And you can start to think about the words that are around it. This is probably not going to be too much help if you're a beginner speaker, but if you're an intermediate speaker, this is going to help you loads because you probably already understand other words that you can put together to make a context from what you're listening to. The second thing you need to do is you need to stop saying, is it ser? Is it estar? Instead, you need to go out and you need to create sentences and start putting yourself out there and speaking to someone. If you're speaking to someone in Spanish and you say something incorrectly, 9 out of 10 times they will correct you. Unless you're trying to have a conversation where you're trying to buy something, or maybe you're trying to sell something. In this instance, most of the time they're just going to value being able to understand you over correcting you. But in the 15 years I've been learning Spanish, whenever I speak to somebody, they have always corrected my Spanish, and even now, because the goal of Spanish is not to speak it correctly 100% of the time, just like we do in English. And as a second language learner, that's just not something that's going to happen. Even myself, who has a master's degree in Spanish, when I'm speaking, I still make small mistakes. It doesn't mean I don't understand, but these are called production errors, and the ability to go back through and fix them is what's going to make you a resilient and better Spanish speaker. So the first thing you need to do is stop asking, is it ser or is it estar? Instead, just start speaking. And if it's wrong, somebody will correct you, and you don't need to question it. So don't say, oh, well, why is it ser? Why is it estar? Just accept it for how it is, because Spanish and English are two vastly different languages, and the deeper you get into learning, the more you're going to see how these languages work differently and how to better express yourself in Spanish rather than English. So that's the first thing. Stop thinking in English and stop saying, well, why is it this way? Instead, just accept it, embrace it. Once you do that, I recommend, and this is something I use to help me learn a lot of Spanish words and a lot of Spanish phrases, is once you hear it, write it down and force yourself over the next week to use that in Spanish as much as you can. So if you're talking about hair and the verb is ser, you're going to want to go through and you're going to want to use this structure that you've heard again and again at least once a day for the next week. And what you're doing here is you're spacing out the repetition. When you practice again and again, your brain is less likely to forget what you are saying. I promise you it will work. You just might have to practice a couple times to get in the habit of doing it. let's move on to my rule that will really help you understand when to use estar and when to use ser. And I always like to tell stories. When I was in the university, I was still learning Spanish, and it was at a pretty basic level. So I went to the university, and I had a teacher there. Best teacher ever, taught me so much in Spanish, did so much more than anybody up to this point to help me really understand Spanish grammar at a very high level. And what she did was said, don't think about estar as something that's temporary, right? And this is one of the things that I see a lot of teachers do. They generally tend to teach estar as something that is temporary, so something that can change, something that isn't permanent, right? And it sounds really simple on the base level. For example, in Spanish, when you say you're dead, or when you say somebody else is dead, you don't say es muerto. Why not? If ser is for permanent and estar is for temporary, why don't you say es muerto instead of está muerto? If ser is something that's permanent, obviously you would think, once somebody's dead, well, they're gone. They're dead, right? But herein lies the bigger picture. You use estar for conditions that can change. When I was in the university, I was massively overweight. I mean, I'm not the skinniest dude right now, but when I say I was overweight, I was like 300 plus pounds. And if you don't believe me, go ahead and take a look at this picture here. This is me when I was in university. This was my third year of university, and here's me just a year after. So, I worked on this quite a bit, and these two pictures here are really going to help you understand my story and understand how to use estar a little bit better. So, I was like this, and I was taking this Spanish course with my teacher, and I got an A+ in her class because she did a great job of explaining everything to me. Now, a year later, after I had already finished her courses and I was already much more fluent in Spanish, I was back at the university finishing up my 4th year, getting my degree, and I saw this teacher walking in the hall. And I walked right by her and she didn't even recognize me, right? Because when she knew me, I looked like this. And I went back and I said, "Hey, how's it going? How are you? I want to thank you so much for helping me understand Spanish. I have a much deeper understanding of it." And she was like, "Oh, I'm sorry, who are you?" When I explained to her, she saw me like this, right? And she said, "Wow." She completely changed and she immediately started talking to me in Spanish because as a Spanish teacher, that's her goal, to get me speaking as much as possible. And even though I wasn't in her course, she knew my Spanish was a pretty good level already. So she looked at me and she said, "Wow, Sean, estás muy flaco." And it got me thinking for a moment, why did she say estás flaco instead of eres flaco? And the thing is, she was talking about a temporary condition. So in her mind, she knew me as this person. So in the bigger picture, she originally met me and she knew me as a bigger boy. But whenever I saw her now, she saw a change in that condition, right? She saw me as someone very skinny now. And from her mindset, from what she knew me to now, was a changing condition for me. So all you have to do is remember that estar is used for a change in condition. Don't use it for permanent or something temporary because that's never going to work. I never got this big ever again. So me losing the weight, that's not something temporary for me. That's something I did and I kept this weight off. Instead, it was a change in condition. How does this work whenever we're talking about es muerto versus está muerto? If we're thinking about this in terms of death, right? When someone dies, that's a changing condition. They're changing from someone alive into someone that's no longer living. That is a permanent change of condition. But we can't think of this in terms of permanent and not permanent. Instead, you only have to think about it in terms of a condition. So, what would happen if somebody who met me when I looked like this were to meet me now? Here, I'm pretty thin. I did a pretty good job of losing the weight, if I say so myself. But what would happen if I met somebody now that I'm a little bit bigger and they originally knew me like this? Probably going to say, "Wow, Sean, estás gordo." Because in their mind, I am not a fat person. It's the first impression I had from them, and it's the association that they have made with me as a person. So, this is the most simple way to think about using ser and estar. Use estar for a change of condition. One more rule is very simple. Whenever you're talking about location, use estar all the time. If you stick to these two rules, change of condition or location and use a star for them, it's going to be so much easier. Just keep in mind that the way people perceive you is also going to affect whether they use ser or a star. All right, guys, so if you have any questions about this or would like me to explain something and simplify it for you, because I know a lot of teachers really jump into teaching grammar and that doesn't really work for me. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I will be more than happy to let you know. And if you have any stories like this where somebody, said ser or a star for you because maybe you've lost weight or maybe you had some surgery, let me know. I would love to hear your comments in the section below. And don't forget, if you would like to learn Spanish in a way that's super simple, a way that I did that will help you and guarantee your success, go ahead and check the link in the comments and I would be more than delighted to help you on your way. All right, guys, see you soon. Bye-bye.